It's definitely a historic day. I think it may be one of the first times that the Supreme Court has actually ruled on the merits of something Trump did, as opposed to simply issuing stays or not issuing stays or whatever. And it was obviously a pretty resounding defeat for him. He has some alternatives in terms of other ways to impose the tariffs, as he said at his news conference after the court decision was announced. I don't think it's, and you can see in the stock market reaction today, which was pretty nothing. It was widely expected. I think the 6-3 and who was on which side was a little bit interesting, but the gist of it was expected. As Trump pointed out in his press conference, it was a little surprising that the court didn't say what to do with the $140 billion that's been collected. It's a big mess, obviously.
The Supreme Court of the United States, by a 6-3 decision, overturned some tariffs imposed by President Trump. Steve Rattner is a former New York Times journalist and Wall Street official who now manages Michael Bloomberg's wealth and appears frequently on Morning Joe on MS Now. We talked about the significance of the Supreme Court decision and President Trump's response. I'm pleased to have Steve Rattner join me to consider this important decision by the Supreme Court. Steve, thank you for joining me. This is, I assume, a historic day based on the Supreme Court decision on tariffs. Tell me why it's important.
It's definitely a historic day. I think it may be one of the first times that the Supreme Court has actually ruled on the merits of something Trump did, as opposed to simply issuing stays or not issuing stays or whatever. And it was obviously a pretty resounding defeat for him. He has some alternatives in terms of other ways to impose the tariffs, as he said at his news conference after the court decision was announced. I don't think it's, and you can see in the stock market reaction today, which was pretty nothing. It was widely expected. I think the 6-3 and who was on which side was a little bit interesting, but the gist of it was expected. As Trump pointed out in his press conference, it was a little surprising that the court didn't say what to do with the $140 billion that's been collected. It's a big mess, obviously. The companies have paid this money, and the question is, do they get it back, and who gets it back? And just the questions go on and on. He has already said he's going to go ahead with a 10% tariff and then various other tariffs. He has plenty of other authorities if he wants to keep going down that rabbit hole. I'm not a huge trade guy, but there's a bunch of other statutes that allow him to impose tariffs. The difference between this and that, this one he tried to do just unilaterally blanket, here's the tariff. These other statutes, some of them are for temporary tariffs. Some of them limit the amount to, say, 25%. Some of them say that he has to do a finding, a whole process, like find that there's been illegal trade activity on the part of China or whomever he's trying to go after. So they're all more cumbersome and less facile than the one he used.
Are you surprised by the decision?
No, I think everybody expected the decision. The only thing I'm not a Supreme Court guy either. The only thing I was surprised about a bit was Justice Kavanaugh. I think Alito and Thomas will always vote on the side of the president on basically anything. And then he got the other 6 justices. So the only one that maybe was a little bit of a surprise was Kavanaugh. But I think Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett, I think everybody expected would go with the majority. Because it would create
but Gorsuch went with the majority as well.
And Gorsuch may have been a little bit less clear. So, you basically got, as I see it, and again, I'm not a Supreme Court guy, Roberts and Barrett, Amy Coney Barrett a bit more reasonable, and Gorsuch and Kavanaugh kind of somewhere in the middle, and then Alito and Thomas pretty hard right.
So the big question now is what to do with the money that has been raised by tariffs?
Well, it's a question. It's $140 billion in an economy that's over $20 trillion. It's obviously not a huge sum of money, but it's a mess. I think the big question is how hard the president will push on new tariffs. As I said, he's already announced the 10% blanket tariff. And we'll see what he decides to do. It's become a bit of a test of wills. I think one has to say in honesty, whichever side of this you're on, that the tariffs have had less of an impact than people expected. They've had less of an impact in terms of inflation and who pays them and all that kind of stuff that we debated for a good while. But it's also had less impact on our imports. In fact, coincidentally, I think it was yesterday, it was announced that our imports went up last year instead of down. The president, tends to ignore the facts, as you know, but the fact is that it's really not had that much of an impact either way.
In fact, I have it in front of me. Trade deficit in goods hit record high in 2025.
Yeah.
A record high in terms of what we brought in versus what we sold out.
Exactly.
I mean, tariffs has been Donald Trump's thing. I mean, he's called it beautiful and he's called it the most wonderful word in the English language and all those kinds of things without being specific. Does it do nothing to that notion of his belief in tariffs and his commitment to tariffs and his use of tariffs?
I think the short answer is no. I think, if anything, it makes him more resolute about using them. But remember that wonderful acronym that the columnist for the Financial Times coined, TACO. Trump always chickens out. And when you look back, if you go back to Liberation Day and what he announced then, it's basically been a process. Some have gone up here and there, but mostly they've been coming down. He imposes a tariff, then he backs off of it. He's a bit of a chicken. But look, he fundamentally believes tariffs are good. He fundamentally believes a trade deficit is bad. Trade deficits can be good or bad depending upon other factors. But he's a kind of simple guy, and to him, a deficit is a bad thing, and therefore you put tariffs on to eradicate the deficit.
To raise revenue.
And he thinks, and raise revenues. Again, 140 billion is not nothing, but in the context of the size of our country and the size of our budget, it's not a reason to do tariffs. Look, to that extent, to the extent you're raising revenue, it is just a tax. You could put on a national sales tax. You could put a tax on dogs and cats. You could put any kind of taxes on and raise the revenues. So that's not a reason to do this.
We'll have a full conversation with Steve Rattner later, talking about the economy, China, and tariffs.